Welcome back, Focus Learners. Today we're taking a seriously fascinating and honestly kind of unnerving journey into the human mind. We're looking at the dark realities of how we behave when we're swallowed up by a crowd, and what happens when normal people are thrown into a simulated prison. So let's dive right into this explainer and unpack the psychology behind why we can lose our sense of self when we join a group. Here's the agenda for our explainer today. First up, the psychology of crowd behavior. Number 2, setting up the prison. Third, the descent into chaos. Fourth, conclusions on coercive power. And finally, number 5, the grave evaluation. Section 1, psychology of crowd behavior. Okay, I want you to picture yourself in a massive crowd. Maybe you're at a packed concert or just a really busy city square. Why do we act so differently in that kind of environment? You see, when we're highly identifiable, when we're conscious of ourselves, we tend to behave pretty cautiously. We act in tune with the person we think we ought to be. Psychologists call this having a high degree of individuation. But put us in a massive crowd, that individual caution just kind of vanishes. Psychologists actually have a few ways to explain this shift. First, there's convergence theory. This basically argues that crowds form when people who already have similar personalities or goals unite. It's that classic strength in numbers idea, right? An individual might not act out alone, but joining with others makes the goal feel totally achievable. On the flip side, we've got emergent norm theory. This one suggests crowds actually start out with very little in common, but as they mill about, certain key members or leaders suggest actions, and the rest of the group just conforms, establishing entirely new norms on the fly. And that brings us to an absolutely crucial concept: de-individuation. This is literally the exact opposite of that cautious self-awareness we were just talking about. De-individuation is a state triggered by anonymity, diffused responsibility, and active participation. It literally frees a person from the rules of normal social behavior. It's wild. And as we're about to see, Haney, Banks, and Zimbardo's famous 1973 simulated prison study serves as a powerful, undeniable proof of just how deeply de-individuation can rewrite who we are. Section 2, setting up the prison. Let's look at the core aim of this study. The researchers, Haney, Banks, and Zimbardo, wanted to see exactly what happens when you take normal, average people and assign them the roles of guards and prisoners. Specifically, they were looking for any shifts in emotions, mood, interpersonal interactions, coping skills, and how their attitudes towards themselves and others might change. What's really fascinating to me here is the sample. Out of 75 people who responded to a local newspaper ad, the team selected just 24 male participants who were assessed as normal, healthy males. 22 of them actually took part in the main study, with 2 on standby. They were randomly assigned to be either a guard or a prisoner. Oh, and they were paid $15 a day for their time. Now, to make this simulation feel as real as possible, the researchers didn't just have participants stroll into a lab. No way. The prisoners were unexpectedly arrested at their actual homes by the real Palo Alto City Police Department. They were formally charged, searched, handcuffed, and taken down to a real police station. After getting fingerprinted, they were blindfolded and driven over to the simulated prison. And once they got there, they were stripped, sprayed with delousing spray, made to stand completely naked in the yard, and finally handed their uniform. This whole setup brilliantly illustrates the intentional use of psychology to shape an environment. The uniforms, for instance, were a real game changer, designed to create an immediate, massive power imbalance. The guards got military-style clothing to project power and control, along with instructions to maintain the prison's functioning, though, note this, physical punishment was explicitly banned. The prisoners, on the other hand, wore plain smocks with an ID number. They were only referred to by that number. They had a heavy chain locked around one ankle, and, very deliberately, they weren't allowed undergarments. This was all specifically engineered to humiliate and deeply de-individuate them. Section 3, the descent into chaos. Tracing the timeline of this study shows you just how incredibly fast things went off the rails. On day 1, the guards were already modifying or just flat out ignoring rules, redefining basic prisoner rights as privileges that had to be earned. By day 2, the first extreme emotional reactions from the prisoners kicked off. Fast forward to day 4, and they're holding a completely bizarre parole meeting. By day 6, the whole experiment was terminated. It was supposed to run for 2 full weeks, but things got so bad they had to shut it down 8 days early. Now, you might be wondering, didn't they know they were just in a psychology experiment? Well, the data tells a completely different story.
When researchers bugged the prisoners' private conversations, a staggering 90% of their talk was completely focused on prison conditions, guard harassment, and punishments. Only 10% of the time did they even mention their lives on the outside. For these guys, the psychological reality of this simulated prison was absolute. The guards were exactly the same. They rarely swapped personal info, they just talked about problem prisoners or stayed silent. Get this, the guards even voluntarily worked overtime for no extra pay. The desperation really peaked during that parole meeting on day 4. 3 out of the 5 prisoners who attended literally stated they would willingly forfeit all the money they had earned, the very $15 a day they signed up for in the first place, if it would just get them out of that prison. And honestly, it makes sense why they wanted out. The emotional toll was absolutely devastating. Guard aggression was ramping up daily, especially when they thought they weren't being watched, even as the prisoners became more and more passive and submissive. The interactions between them were just hostile and totally dehumanizing. In fact, 5 prisoners had to be released early because of extreme emotional reactions. We're talking crying, severe depression, acute anxiety, and uncontrollable rage. One participant even broke out in a psychosomatic rash over his entire body before they let him go.
Section 4. Conclusions on coercive power.
The conclusions from all this chaos are incredibly stark. First, the guards easily acquired high social status and the ability to exercise complete, self-serving control over others. The prisoners? Well, they initially tried to rebel, but when that failed, they spiraled into depression, isolation, and deep anxiety. That profound loss of identity led directly to compliance and total dependence on the guards just for basic necessities. On top of that, being forced to wear those smocks without underclothes actually forced the prisoners to move and sit in unfamiliar, more passive or feminine ways, which the powerful guards used to further emasculate them. The overarching takeaway here is terrifying. Coercive power in a given environment can intensely dictate human behavior. It turns out normal people really aspire to be powerful and deeply, deeply despise feeling powerless.
Section 5. The grave evaluation. Let's run this whole thing through the grave evaluation. Starting with generalizability, this is a distinct weakness. The sample was highly unrepresentative, just 24 normal, healthy, middle-class, white male college students. We definitely have to be careful about assuming everyone would react exactly this way. For reliability, though, it's a solid strength. The situation was tightly controlled with really stringent selection criteria and random allocation for who became a guard or a prisoner. For application, it's another strength. The findings actually provide profound insight into real-world prison power dynamics and hierarchies. Validity is a bit of a mixed bag, which we'll break down in just a second. And ethics? Yeah, a massive, undeniable weakness due to the severe distress it caused. Let's zoom in on that validity debate for a moment. Zimbardo went to absolute extremes for realism, like having actual police arrest the guys at their homes. That gives the study a really high degree of ecological validity. I mean, remember, 90% of their conversation was about the prison. Some prisoners even literally asked a visiting priest to get them a lawyer. But critics hit back by pointing out it has low ecological validity because, for obvious practical and ethical reasons, it completely lacked the genuinely horrific elements of real prisons. Things like entrenched racism, beatings, and real physical threats to life. Plus, it always had a strict 2-week maximum limit looming over it. And then, of course, we have to talk about the ethical criticisms. The source material doesn't sugarcoat this. Participants were subjected to extreme, genuine distress. The prisoners endured intense punishments at the hands of the guards, including being locked in isolation. So while the study unquestionably gave the world invaluable psychological data on human behavior, it undeniably trampled over ethical boundaries regarding participant well-being. That is exactly why they had to pull the plug on it early. Which brings us to a final, pretty heavy thought. We've just seen how de-individuation and being handed an authoritative role can completely overwrite a perfectly normal person's behavior in just a matter of days. So I have to ask you, if you were stripped of your name, handed a uniform, and thrust into a system of absolute power, either as the one wielding the club or the one being crushed by it, how much of the real you would actually remain? It is a fragile reality to consider. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, Focus Learners. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.